In 1915, a British medical corps established a field hospital in a Serbian village, so remote that maps disagreed on its name. The wounded arrived in wagons that left trails of blood in the snow. The local priest warned us not to treat soldiers after dark, not to let them die with their mouths open, and never to bury anyone without the proper rites. We dismissed his words as superstition, born from centuries of war and plague. Then men began dying in ways that no wound could explain, drained and pale with expressions of pure terror frozen on their faces. The villagers knew what hunted in those mountains, and they tried to tell us before it was too late. So before we continue, please make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks! I was 26 when I arrived in the Balkans with the Royal Army Medical Corps. My name is Dr. Thomas Hartley, and I had completed my medical training at Guy's Hospital in London only 2 years before the war began. I volunteered because I believed I could save lives, because the newspapers made it sound noble, and because I had never seen true suffering. The Balkans would teach me about all three in ways I still cannot fully process even now, decades later. We traveled by train from Salonika through mountain passes where the rail lines had been damaged by retreating Austrian forces. Our unit consisted of 12 men. Major Edmund Pierce commanded the medical staff with the kind of precision that came from 20 years of military service. Captain David Walsh served as chief surgeon, a Dublin man with steady hands and a dark sense of humor that kept morale from collapsing entirely. The nursing orderlies included Sergeant Robert Mills, Corporal Henry Davies, and Private Samuel Fletcher, all experienced men who had served in France before being reassigned to this remote theater. We had 3 local interpreters, 2 Serbian medical students named Petar and Milan, who spoke passable English, and an older man named Lazar, who had lived in London for several years before the war. The village we reached in late November of 1915 had no official name on British maps. The locals called it Kurva Rea, which Lazar translated as Blood River, named for the stream that ran red with iron deposits and turned the snow along its banks a pale pink. The village consisted of perhaps 30 stone houses built into the hillside, a small Orthodox church with a copper dome turned green with age, and a cluster of outbuildings that had once served as a monastery. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. The ground was already frozen hard, and the first heavy snows had begun to fall. When we arrived, the villagers watched from doorways with expressions that mixed curiosity with something darker, a wariness that I mistook for simple peasant suspicion of outsiders. We established our field hospital in the largest monastery building, a structure with thick stone walls and narrow windows that let in almost no natural light. The space had served as a granary before the war, and we spent 2 days clearing out rotting wheat and mouse droppings before we could set up our surgical tables and medical supplies. The ceiling was low and the air stayed cold no matter how many fires we built. Our breath hung visible even inside. The floors were uneven stone worn smooth by centuries of feet. The wounded began arriving the same day we finished setting up. They came in wagons pulled by exhausted horses, wrapped in blood-stained blankets, their faces gray with pain and cold. The fighting had been fierce in the mountain passes to the east, where Austrian and Bulgarian forces were pushing against the retreating Serbian army. Most of the casualties we saw were Serbian soldiers, though we also treated a handful of French troops and even a few captured Austrians who arrived under guard. The wounds were what you would expect from modern warfare. Shrapnel injuries that tore through muscle and shattered bone, bullet wounds that required careful probing to extract the projectiles, frostbite that had already turned fingers and toes black, and the inevitable infections that followed any penetrating trauma in these unsanitary conditions. We worked in shifts, sleeping only a few hours at a time, our hands raw from constant washing in cold water and carbolic solution. Major Pierce insisted on maintaining proper medical protocols despite the primitive conditions. He had us keep detailed records of every patient, noting their wounds, treatments administered, and outcomes. Captain Walsh performed amputations with the skill of a man who had done hundreds, working quickly to minimize blood loss and shock. The orderlies managed the post-operative ward, changing dressings, administering morphine, and doing their best to keep men comfortable as they either recovered or died. The local villagers kept their distance at first. We would see them watching from doorways or standing in small groups near the church, but they rarely approached the hospital directly. The priest, a tall man with a long gray beard and eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you, came to visit on our third day. He spoke no English, and Lazar translated his warning. The priest said that we had chosen a cursed place for our hospital. He said the old monastery had been abandoned for good reason, that men had died there in ways that could not be explained. He said we should not treat the wounded after sunset, that if a man died in our care, we must ensure his mouth was closed and bound, that coins must be placed on his eyes, and that the body must be buried before the next nightfall with proper orthodox rites. He said that the mountains held old evils that the war had awakened, and that we were fools to dismiss what the villagers had known for generations. Major Pierce thanked him politely through Lazar and assured him we would respect local customs where possible, but that we were British military surgeons bound by our own protocols and could not allow superstition to interfere with medical care. The priest's face darkened. He made the sign of the cross, muttered something in Serbian that Lazar did not translate, and left without another word. That evening, as I sat writing up my case notes by lamplight, I asked Lazar what the priest had said at the end. Lazar hesitated, then told me the priest had said we would learn soon enough, and that when we did, we should remember he had tried to warn us. I wrote it off as the usual clash between modern medicine and traditional belief that occurred whenever Western doctors worked in remote regions. I did not give it another thought. The first death that should have warned us occurred on the 8th night after our arrival. A Serbian soldier named George had been brought in 3 days earlier with a severe abdominal wound from shrapnel. Captain Walsh had operated immediately, removing fragments of metal and repairing what damage he could. But the wound had become infected despite our best efforts with carbolic washes and clean dressings. The infection spread rapidly, and by the 8th night, George was delirious with fever, his abdomen distended and rigid. He died just after midnight. I was on duty in the post-operative ward when it happened. I had checked his pulse at 11:30 and found it weak but present. When I returned at 10 past midnight to administer another dose of morphine, he was gone. His eyes were open and staring at the ceiling. His mouth hung slack. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that I had seen on many corpses. But there was something else. Something I noticed but could not quite name. He looked drained, as if death had taken more than just his life. I closed his eyes and jaw in the standard manner, made the appropriate notes in his file, and called for Sergeant Mills to help me move the body to the small outbuilding we had designated as a temporary morgue. We wrapped Georgia in a sheet and carried him out into the cold night. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky was clear with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Our breath steamed in the frigid air. The morgue was a stone shed with no windows and a heavy wooden door that we kept barred from outside. We laid Georgia on one of the wooden pallets we had arranged along the wall, covered him with another sheet, and secured the door. The temperature inside the shed stayed well below freezing, which served our purposes perfectly for preserving bodies until they could be buried. The next morning, Peter came to find me during breakfast. His face was pale and his hands shook slightly. He said I needed to come to the morgue immediately, that something was wrong. I followed him out across the frozen courtyard. When we reached the shed, I saw that the door stood partially open, the bar lying in the snow. Beside it, Pitar said he had found it that way when he went to prepare George's body for burial. Inside the morgue, George's body was not where we had left it. The pallet where we had placed him was empty, the sheets thrown aside. We found him on the floor near the door, lying face down. His fingernails had left deep scratches in the wood of the door, long gouges that went down to bare timber. His fingers were torn and bloody from the effort. His mouth was open again, wider than I had left it, and his eyes were open as well, staring at nothing. I examined the body carefully. Rigor mortis had not fully set in. Unusual, given the cold and time that had passed. His skin was paler than before, with a grayish tint I had never seen on a corpse. When I lifted his upper lip, his canine teeth seemed slightly longer, though I told myself I must be mistaken. Sergeant Mills suggested we had not secured the door properly, that perhaps an animal had disturbed the body. I wanted to believe that, but it did not account for the scratches or the body's position. Georgia had been dead when we placed him here. I reported to Major Pierce, who agreed circumstances were unusual, but likely had a rational explanation. Perhaps Georgie had not been fully dead when we moved him, and he had regained consciousness briefly. The major ordered that in future we should wait longer before moving bodies and check vital signs more thoroughly. We buried Georgia that afternoon in the cemetery behind the church. The ground was frozen solid. The priest performed burial rites in Serbian. The villagers stood farther back than usual, and several made signs against evil I did not recognize. When the ceremony ended, the priest asked through Lazar that we follow proper customs with our dead. The major assured him we would do our best. The second death occurred 4 nights later. A French soldier named Baptiste died from sepsis following a compound femur fracture. Corporal Davies followed all proper procedures, closed his eyes and mouth, and moved the body to the morgue with Private Fletcher's help. The next morning, we found the morgue door open again. Baptiste's body was missing entirely. We searched everywhere but found no trace of him. No footprints in the fresh snow, no blood, no drag marks, nothing to indicate how or where the body had gone. Major Pierce was furious. He assembled all staff and demanded to know if this was some kind of sick joke. No one admitted to moving the body. The major questioned the interpreters and went into the village to ask if anyone had seen or heard anything. The villagers shook their heads and avoided his eyes. The priest refused to speak to him. We continued our work because there was no alternative. The wounded kept arriving, but tension had developed among the staff. Men looked over their shoulders more often. Sergeant Mills began insisting that 2 orderlies remain with bodies until burial. The third death happened during my shift. A young Serbian soldier named Nikola, barely 18, had been brought in with a severe chest wound. A bullet had penetrated his left lung. He died just after 9 in the evening, struggling for air until the end. This time, I was determined to understand what was happening. I closed Nicola's eyes and mouth and secured his jaw with a strip of cloth tied under his chin and over the top of his head, a practice I had seen in civilian hospitals to keep the mouth closed during rigor mortis. I made my notes, then called for Sergeant Mills. Together, we carried Nicola to the morgue and placed him on a pallet. But instead of leaving, I told Mills I intended to stay and observe the body through the night. Mills looked at me as if I had lost my mind, but he did not argue. He brought me a chair, a heavy blanket, and a thermos of hot tea. He also brought his service revolver and left it on the small table beside my chair. He said he did not know what I thought I would find, but that he would check on me every hour. I thanked him and settled in to wait in the bitterly cold morgue. The only light came from a small oil lamp I had brought with me, which cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Nicola's body lay on the pallet, covered with a white sheet, utterly still. I kept my eyes on him and tried to stay alert despite the exhaustion that pulled at me. The first hour passed slowly. During the second hour, I began to notice changes. Nicola's face grew paler, the skin taking on that same grayish tint. The shadows under his eyes deepened. His lips had drawn back slightly, exposing his teeth, though the cloth securing his jaw was still tight. I returned to my chair and made notes, trying to remain objective. During the third hour, I heard a wet, rasping breath from the direction of the pallet. I grabbed the lamp. Nicola had not moved, but I could have sworn I saw his chest rise and fall once. I checked for respiration and heartbeat. Nothing. By every medical measure, this man was dead. During the fourth hour, more changes appeared. Nicola's fingernails seemed darker, almost black. The cloth around his jaw had loosened further. A smell developed that reminded me of old copper and turned earth. I was examining the fingernails when Nicola's eyes opened. Not slowly, but all at once, snapping wide. I stumbled backward. His eyes were wrong, the pupils too large and completely black, reflecting no light. His mouth opened, the cloth ripping, as his jaw forced itself wider. Then he sat up. I should have run, but I was frozen, unable to move. Nicola turned his head toward me with unnatural fluidity. His lips pulled back from his teeth, and I saw his canines had grown into sharp points. He swung his legs off the pallet and stood. His movements were jerky, uncertain. He took a step toward me. I finally found my voice and shouted for Mills. I grabbed the revolver and pointed it at Nicola. Mills crashed through the door with his rifle. He saw Nicola standing and his face went white. Nicola's head turned toward Mills with that same smooth motion. His mouth opened, wider, and a long, low hiss emerged that sounded nothing like a human voice. Mills fired. The bullet struck Nicola in the chest, where his heart should have been. Nicola looked at the wound, then back at us. He did not fall. I fired 3 times, all center mass. Nicola paused, examined the wounds, then continued advancing. Mills fired again, aiming for the head. The bullet caught the shoulder and spun him around, but still he did not fall. We backed toward the door. Nicola followed faster now, his hands reaching with fingers that had grown longer, the nails extended into claws. We stumbled into the courtyard, and Mills slammed the morgue door. We heard Nicola hit the door, heard his claws scraping wood, heard that hissing growing louder. The noise brought others running. Captain Walsh, Major Pierce, more orderlies. They stopped when they saw our faces and heard the sounds. Mills tried to explain. I stood holding the revolver, hands shaking. The sounds from inside stopped. We waited, staring at that door. Major Pierce ordered us to explain what happened. I told him everything, knowing how insane it sounded. Lazar spoke quietly. He said we needed the priest immediately, that this was not a medical matter. He used a Serbian word that had no exact English equivalent, but the closest translation was vampire. Major Pierce rejected this immediately. He said we would not indulge in peasant superstitions. He ordered Walsh and Mills to open the morgue door while he covered them with his pistol. They opened the door. The morgue was empty. Nicola was gone. The pallet held only torn sheet remnants and the cloth that had bound his jaw. The walls showed fresh scratch marks, but there was no body, no sign of where Nicola had gone or how he had escaped. We searched everywhere, the hospital, the courtyard, the village. We found nothing. As dawn broke, we gathered in the monastery building. Major Pierce said we would continue our work, but from now on, any soldier who died would be buried immediately with whatever rites the priest deemed necessary. Armed guards would be posted at the morgue. Lazar asked permission to bring the priest. Pierce agreed reluctantly. The priest arrived within the hour. He did not look surprised when Lazar explained what had happened. He said he would help us, but we must follow his instructions exactly. He said the creature Nicola had become was called a vampire, that it was not the man we knew, but something that had possessed his body after death. He said it would feed on the living, draining their blood, and would create others like itself. if we did not stop it. The priest gave specific instructions. Any patient who died must have their mouth bound immediately. Coins must be placed on the eyes. The body must not be left alone until burial. The grave must be deep and weighted with stones. Garlic must be placed in the mouth and shroud. A cross must be nailed to the coffin lid. Burial must happen before sunset on the day of death. Major Pierce agreed to follow these instructions. We began implementing the protocols that day. When the next death occurred, we followed every step. The man was buried before sunset with full Orthodox rites. That night, the morgue remained quiet. But Nicola was still out there. The priest said he would have returned to Earth during daylight, seeking darkness. He said we needed to find where the vampire rested and destroy it before nightfall. He organized a search party of village men who knew the terrain. Mills, Davies, and I volunteered to join them. We set out at mid-morning, moving into the hills behind the village. The priest led us to a network of caves that had been used as a hermitage centuries ago. We found Nicola in the third cave, lying in a depression, covered with earth and dead leaves. His eyes were closed and his body rigid. Then I saw his chest move, a shallow rise and fall. The priest approached slowly, speaking prayers. He gestured for villagers to prepare the stake. As they approached, Nicola's eyes opened, those black, lightless eyes. His mouth opened in that terrible hiss. He tried to rise but moved slowly, struggling as if pushing through water. The villagers pinned his arms and legs while the priest positioned the stake over his heart. The priest raised the hammer and drove it through Nicola's chest into the earth beneath. The sound from Nicola's mouth was neither human nor animal, a shriek that echoed through the cave. His body convulsed, then went still. Black blood poured from around the stake. The priest continued prayers while villagers cut off Nicola's head with a long knife. They stuffed his mouth with garlic, placed coins on his eyes, wrapped him in a shroud soaked in holy water. We buried what remained in the church cemetery that evening, in a grave twice the usual depth. The priest conducted a long ceremony. When finished, villagers covered the grave with stones and erected an iron cross. The priest warned us that others might follow. He said the war had disturbed many old places, had awakened things that should have stayed asleep. He said we must remain vigilant and never dismiss the old knowledge. He said the dead do not always rest easy in these lands, especially in times of violence and bloodshed. We returned to the hospital and tried to resume normal routines, but everything had changed. We followed the priest's protocols religiously. Every death was treated with proper rites. Every body was buried quickly. We posted armed guards who carried not just rifles but crosses and holy water. The priest came to bless the hospital building, marking crosses on walls and above doorways. He gave each of us a small wooden cross to wear and taught us prayers in Serbian. Major Pierce accepted all of this without complaint. Whatever skepticism he had held before had died in that morgue. In the weeks that followed, we treated hundreds more wounded. Many died, but with new protocols in place, we had no more incidents of bodies moving or disappearing. The priest performed burial rites for every death. The villagers began to warm to us, bringing food and firewood. But the peace did not last. As winter deepened and fighting intensified, a new problem emerged. The casualties arriving now bore wounds Captain Walsh could not explain, deep punctures in the neck or wrist that had drained victims of blood far beyond what the wounds should have caused. Soldiers who survived spoke of being ambushed at night by shapes that moved too fast to see, by enemies who felt no pain from bullets, by creatures with eyes that reflected lamplight like animals. The priest's face grew grave when he examined these wounds. He said the war had awakened multiple vampire in the mountains, that old burial grounds had been disturbed by shelling in trenches, that bodies left unburied on battlefields were rising after dark. He said we faced not just a medical crisis, but a spiritual one. Major Pierce called a meeting. He asked the priest what could be done. The priest said the hospital grounds must be consecrated with barriers the vampire could not cross. Every entrance must be marked with crosses and garlic. We must never allow anyone to enter after full darkness. We must keep fires burning through the night and ensure no soldier died alone. We implemented these measures immediately. The priest blessed the perimeter. We hung garlic above every door and window. We kept lanterns burning all night. We assigned pairs of orderlies to watch over the dying. And still they came. Not every night, but often enough that we dreaded the darkness. We would hear them moving outside the walls, hear their hissing calls, hear them testing the barriers. Sometimes we found claw marks on the doors in the morning. Sometimes we found dead animals in the courtyard, drained of blood. The worst nights were when they took soldiers who wandered outside despite our warnings. We would find the bodies at dawn, pale and drained. The priest would examine them and determine whether they needed to be destroyed like Nicola or could be safely buried. One night in mid-December, we faced our greatest challenge. A large convoy of wounded arrived just after sunset, far too many for our facility. Major Pierce made the difficult decision to keep the gates open longer to allow all the wounded inside, knowing that leaving them outside meant certain death. The last wagon was still unloading when we heard them. First a few distant calls, then more, then a chorus of hisses echoing from the mountains. The priest began praying loudly. The orderlies worked frantically to get the wounded inside. I helped carry a soldier with a shattered leg, my boots slipping on ice. They hit the barriers at 3 points simultaneously. The north wall attack shook the stones. The crosses we had nailed there burst into flames. The vampire recoiled, but immediately tested another spot. The second attack was on the main gate. Something was tearing at the wood, ripping planks free. Through the gap, I caught glimpses of pale figures moving with inhuman speed. The third attack was most cunning. They had learned the church was not protected the same way. Several vampire climbed onto the church roof and began tearing at the copper dome, trying to drop into the building and breach the hospital from inside. The priest saw this and ran toward the church. Mills and Davies took positions at the compromised gate with rifles. They fired into the darkness. Captain Walsh stood in the hospital doorway with his pistol. Private Fletcher climbed onto the monastery roof with blessed oil, pouring it along the edge where walls met roof. I ran after the priest into the church. Inside it was dark, except for the perpetual candle. The priest moved quickly to light more candles. I could see their hands reaching through the hole they were tearing in the dome. Pieces of metal and debris rained down. The priest began the most powerful prayers I had ever heard. He held his cross high, and I swear I saw it begin to glow. The hands recoiled from that light. The tearing stopped for a moment. Then one of them dropped through the hole. It landed in a crouch between us and the door. It had once been a man, though hard to determine which army. Its uniform was torn, its skin gray and stretched tight, its eyes those bottomless black pits, its mouth open to reveal elongated fangs. I had no weapon except my medical bag and the cross the priest had given me weeks before. I pulled the cross from under my shirt and held it out. The creature's eyes flickered toward me, and for just an instant it hesitated. That instant was enough. The priest struck with movements too fast for his age. He produced a long wooden stake from within his cassock and drove it forward in a single fluid motion. The stake caught the vampire in the center of its chest. The creature shrieked and clawed at the stake, but the priest was already upon it, pushing the stake deeper, forcing it down. More were coming through the hole. The priest shouted at me in Serbian. I did not understand the words, but his meaning was clear. I ran for the door while he held them back with prayers and crosses and unshakable faith. I burst out of the church into chaos. The main gate had been breached. Several vampire had forced their way into the courtyard. Mills and Davies were fighting them with rifle butts since bullets had no effect. Captain Walsh had organized the walking wounded into a defensive line, arming them with whatever they could find. Major Pierce stood in the center of the courtyard, holding a cross in one hand and a flaming torch in the other, shouting orders as if this were a normal military engagement. The vampire circled him, but would not approach too close to the flames. I grabbed a shovel and moved to help Davies, who had been knocked down. The vampire loomed over him, jaws opening wide. I swung the shovel, catching it in the head. The creature barely noticed, but turned its attention to me. Then Lazar was there with an iron poker, driving it through the vampire's back. Davies recovered and joined in with a broken table leg. Together, we forced it back while Mills came running with a proper stake. All around the courtyard, similar struggles were happening. The wounded who could move were fighting alongside medical staff. The villagers who had stayed used techniques passed down through generations. The night was filled with screams and prayers and the sounds of wood splintering. I do not know how long the battle lasted. At some point, dawn began to break in the east. The vampires seemed to sense it. Their attacks became more desperate. They were trying to kill as many as possible before the sun forced them to retreat. The priest emerged from the church, his robes torn and bloody but alive. He carried a censer, swinging it back and forth, filling the air with incense smoke. The vampire could not bear it. They fell back before him, hissing and clawing at their own faces. He walked through the courtyard like a general advancing, pushing them back toward the breached gate. As the first direct rays of sunlight touched the mountaintops, the vampire fled. They moved with terrible speed, but now in retreat. They vanished into the forest, into the caves, into whatever dark places they sheltered from the day. The casualties were counted. 3 villagers dead, drained of blood. 5 soldiers dead, 7 more wounded from the fighting, and we had destroyed 6 vampire completely, their bodies now burning in a pyre the priest had built. Major Pierce called another meeting. His hands shook slightly as he poured himself whiskey and drank it in one swallow. He said we could not continue like this, that we could not defend the hospital against nightly attacks while trying to treat the wounded. He asked the priest what could be done. The priest's answer was simple but difficult. He said we needed to find where the vampire rested during the day and destroy them all, every single one, before they could attack again. He said there was an old burial ground in the mountains, a place where medieval victims of plague had been thrown into mass graves without proper rites. He said the shelling had disturbed those graves, and he believed that was where the majority of the vampire originated. He said we needed to go there, stake and behead every corpse we found, and consecrate the ground to prevent more from rising. It was a monumental task. The burial ground was several miles away, through mountain terrain, held by neither side, a no man's land, where Serbian, Austrian, and Bulgarian forces all operated. We would need armed escorts and supplies and time, all in short supply. But Major Pierce saw no alternative. He said he would request a military detachment to accompany us, and that we would launch the expedition as soon as possible. The military detachment arrived 3 days later, 20 Serbian soldiers under the command of a Captain Petrovic, who had fought in both Balkan wars before this larger conflict began. He was a hard man with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much death. When Major Pierce explained what we needed to do, Petrovic did not laugh or question our sanity. He simply nodded and said his men knew the old burial ground, that they had lost comrades near there under circumstances they could not explain, and that they would be glad to settle accounts with whatever haunted that cursed place. We prepared for the expedition with the same care we would have given to a military operation in enemy territory, because that was essentially what it was. The priest provided us with enough stakes, crosses, holy water, and garlic to treat dozens of bodies. We packed shovels, picks, axes, and hammers. We brought kerosene and matches for burning. Captain Walsh assembled a medical kit in case of injuries. Mills, Davies, Fletcher, and I would represent the hospital staff. Lazar and Petar would come as interpreters. The priest insisted on leading the expedition himself despite his age, saying that his prayers and knowledge would be essential for consecrating the ground properly once the vampire were destroyed. We set out before dawn, on a morning when fresh snow had fallen during the night. covering the mountains in a clean white blanket that seemed to mock the ugliness of what we were about to do. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and our breath hung in frozen clouds. We traveled in two groups, the soldiers forming a protective perimeter around the medical staff and the priest. Captain Petrovich's men were armed with rifles, but they also carried long knives and wooden stakes at their belts. They had fought vampire before, I realized, whether they called them by that name or simply thought of them as a particularly vicious type of enemy. The journey took most of the morning. We climbed through mountain passes where the snow lay deep and the wind cut through our coats like knives. We saw evidence of recent fighting. Shell craters that had torn great chunks out of the hillsides, trenches that had been hastily dug and then abandoned, and bodies that no one had been able to retrieve for burial. The priest stopped at each body we passed and said a quick prayer, making the sign of the cross. Some of the bodies were fresh, killed within the last few days. Others had been there longer, preserved by the cold, their faces frozen in expressions of their final moments. Captain Petrovich called a halt when we reached a ridge that overlooked a small valley. Below us, I could see the burial ground the priest had spoken of. It was larger than I had expected, perhaps 2 acres of uneven ground, where the earth had been disturbed in dozens of places. Some of the disturbances looked old, evidence of the original plague graves from centuries past. Others were fresh, torn open by shells or deliberately excavated by something digging its way out from below. The priest studied the ground through a pair of field glasses and spoke quietly to Lazar. Lazar translated for us. The priest said he could see at least 30 separate points where vampire might be sheltering, but there could be more beneath the snow. He said we needed to work systematically, checking every disturbed patch of earth, destroying any vampire we found, and then consecrating the entire area before sunset. He said if we failed to finish before dark, we would be trapped in the burial ground when the vampire rose for the night, and none of us would survive. Major Pierce checked his pocket watch. It was just past noon. We had perhaps 5 hours of usable daylight, maybe 6 if we pushed it. He organized us into teams of 4, each team consisting of 2 soldiers, 1 medical staff member, and the priest rotating between teams to perform the final consecrations. We would work from the perimeter inward, ensuring we did not leave any vampire behind us that could cut off our retreat. The first grave we opened held the body of an Austrian soldier, his uniform still partially intact despite the months he had spent in the frozen earth. His eyes were closed and his hands were folded on his chest, and for a moment I thought perhaps this was just an ordinary corpse. Then the priest leaned close and lifted one of the soldier's eyelids. The eye beneath was completely black, and even in death it seemed to track the priest's movements. The priest stepped back and gestured for the soldiers to proceed. They drove the stake through with practiced efficiency. The body convulsed despite being frozen, the mouth snapping open to reveal elongated fangs, the hands clawing at the earth. Black blood poured from around the stake, steaming in the cold air. One of the soldiers used a long knife to sever the head, while the other held the thrashing body down. When it was done, they stuffed the mouth with garlic and poured holy water over the remains. The priest said his prayers and we moved to the next grave. We found 12 vampire in the first hour. Some were recent soldiers killed in the fighting and then transformed by the evil that saturated this ground. Others were ancient, their bodies so decayed that it was impossible to tell how long they had been buried here, but all of them showed the same signs when we opened their resting places: the black eyes, the elongated teeth, the unnatural preservation of the flesh, and that terrible animation when the stake went in, as if some part of them still clung to their stolen existence. The work was exhausting and horrifying. My hands were blistered from swinging the pick to break through frozen earth. My arms ached from helping to hold down bodies that fought with inhuman strength, even as they were destroyed. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and that strange copper scent that seemed to surround all the vampire, but we could not stop or slow down. down. The sun was already past its peak and beginning its descent toward the western mountains. In the second hour, we found something worse. A mass grave that held at least 20 bodies, all of them showing signs of vampirism. The priest's face grew pale when he saw it. He said this must have been where the original outbreak occurred during the plague centuries ago, that all of these people had died and been thrown into a common pit without proper rites, and that the evil had taken root in this place and festered for generations. He said we needed to burn this entire grave. Rather than trying to stake each body individually, the soldiers poured kerosene over the pit while the priest walked the perimeter, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers in a voice that never wavered despite the horror before us. When the fire was lit, the bodies began to move. Arms reached up from the flames, mouths opened in silent screams. The smell of burning flesh mixed with something else, something sulfurous and wrong. We stood back and watched as the fire consumed them all, and I found myself praying for the first time since childhood, praying that their souls could finally find rest after all these years of unnatural existence. The third hour brought us to the center of the burial ground, where the earth was most disturbed. Here we found the lair of what must have been the oldest and most powerful of the vampire. The opening to an old crypt had been exposed by recent shelling, and a stone stairway led down into darkness. The priest said we could not leave without clearing this crypt, that whatever dwelled below was likely the source of the corruption that had spread through the burial ground. Captain Petrovich ordered his men to light torches and prepare for close combat in confined spaces. Major Pierce tried to insist that the medical staff remain above ground, but I refused. I had come this far, and I would not turn back now. Mills and Davies felt the same. We descended into the crypt with 6 soldiers, the priest, and our weapons and tools. The crypt was older than I had expected, its stone walls covered with Orthodox icons that had faded with age. The air was thick and stale, and our torches barely seemed to penetrate the darkness. We found burial niches carved into the walls, most of them empty, their occupants long since turned to dust. But at the far end of the crypt, in a larger chamber, we found 3 stone sarcophagi arranged in a triangle. The lids of the sarcophagi had been pushed aside. Inside each one lay a vampire, but these were different from the others we had encountered. They were larger, more powerful in appearance, and their bodies showed no signs of decay, despite what must have been centuries in the grave. They wore the robes of Orthodox clergy, and I realized, with a sick feeling, that these must have been the priests who had served this monastery before it was abandoned, who had perhaps been the first victims of the plague and the first to rise as vampire. The priest crossed himself and began his prayers. The 3 vampire opened their eyes simultaneously, and I saw an intelligence in those black depths that the others had lacked. These were not mindless creatures driven by hunger alone. They were something more, something that retained memory and purpose and malice. They sat up in their sarcophagi with movements that were slow and deliberate, and they looked at us with what I can only describe as contempt. Captain Petrovich did not hesitate. He rushed forward with his stake raised and drove it toward the nearest vampire's chest. But the creature moved with speed that defied belief, catching Petrovich's wrist in one hand and twisting. I heard bones snap, and Petrovich cried out and dropped the stake. The vampire threw him against the wall with casual force that left him crumpled and unconscious. The other 2 vampires rose from their sarcophagi and spread out, cutting off our escape route to the stairs. The soldiers opened fire with their rifles, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. The bullets struck the vampire, but did nothing to slow them. One of the creatures moved into the group of soldiers and began killing with terrifying efficiency, snapping necks and crushing skulls with its bare hands. The men tried to fight back with their knives and stakes, but they were no match for the speed and strength of something that had hunted for centuries. The priest stepped forward, his cross held high, his voice rising in a prayer that seemed to shake the very stones of the crypt. The vampire recoiled from him, not in fear, but in something like pain. The holy words seemed to burn them in a way that bullets could not. The priest advanced step by step, driving the vampire back toward their sarcophagi. I saw my chance. While the priest held their attention, I grabbed one of the fallen stakes and moved toward the vampire that had attacked Petrovich. It sensed me and turned, its hand shooting out to grab my throat. Its grip was like iron, and I felt my windpipe begin to crush. But Mills was there, driving his stake into the creature's back. The vampire released me and whirled on Mills, but Davies hit it from the other side with an axe, the blade biting deep into its shoulder. The creature staggered, and I drove my stake into its chest with all my remaining strength. The point found the heart, and the vampire shrieked, a sound that seemed to come from some place beyond human experience. It clawed at the stake, but the priest was there now, pressing his cross against the creature's forehead. Where the cross touched, the flesh burned and smoked. The vampire collapsed, still thrashing, and one of the soldiers finished the job with his knife. The remaining two vampires seemed to realize they were in danger for the first time in centuries. They moved to attack the priest directly, willing to endure the pain of his holy symbols to destroy the one man who could truly harm them. But the soldiers had rallied, and they threw themselves at the vampire with desperate courage. It became a brutal melee in that dark crypt, men dying to buy seconds for their comrades to land strikes, stakes being driven and torn out and driven again, blood both red and black soaking into the ancient stones. I do not know how long the battle lasted. I remember driving a stake into yielding flesh and feeling it scrape against bone. I remember the spray of black blood across my face and the burning sensation where it touched my skin. I remember Mills screaming as one of the vampire tore into his shoulder and Davies pulling him free while I drove a knife into the creature's eye. I remember the priest's voice never faltering, never stopping, holding back the darkness with nothing but faith and words. When it ended, both vampire were down, stakes through their hearts, heads severed, mouths stuffed with garlic. 5 soldiers were dead, and 3 more were badly wounded. Mills was bleeding heavily from his shoulder wound. Captain Petrovich had regained consciousness, but his wrist was clearly broken. But we had won. The ancient vampire that had corrupted this burial ground for centuries were destroyed. The priest worked quickly to consecrate the crypt while we carried our wounded back to the surface. The sun was low on the horizon now, perhaps an hour of daylight remaining. We still had to consecrate the entire burial ground and ensure no vampire remained to rise after dark. The priest organized the surviving soldiers into groups to spread blessed salt around the perimeter while he walked the grounds one final time, checking each destroyed grave, saying prayers over each burned pit. I tended to Mills's wound as best I could with my limited supplies. The vampire's claws had torn deep into the muscle, and I was worried about infection, but there was nothing I could do here except clean it with what little carbolic solution I had and bind it tightly. Davies helped me splint Petrovich's wrist. The Serbian captain bore the pain without complaint, watching the priest work with eyes that held a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The sun touched the top of the western mountains. We had perhaps 30 minutes of light left. The priest completed his final circuit and returned to where we had gathered. He said the ground was now consecrated, that no vampire would rise here again, and that the souls of all who had been buried here could finally rest. He said we needed to leave immediately, because even though this ground was now protected, there were other places in these mountains where the vampires sheltered, and they would be rising soon to hunt. We made our way back through the mountain passes as darkness fell. We moved as quickly as we could while carrying our wounded, but it was slow going in the dark and the snow. Captain Petrovich had his men light torches and form a defensive perimeter around our group. Every shadow seemed to hold threat. Every sound made us turn with weapons ready. We heard them before we saw them, the same hissing calls we had heard during the attack on the hospital, but more distant, coming from multiple directions. They were tracking us through the mountains, staying just out of sight but making sure we knew they were there. Petrovich ordered his men to close ranks and keep moving. We could not afford to stop or make a stand in the open. Our only hope was to reach the hospital before they decided to attack. The calls grew closer. I caught glimpses of pale shapes moving between the trees, keeping pace with us, waiting for weakness or opportunity. One of the wounded soldiers stumbled and fell, and before we could help him up, a vampire shot out from the darkness and seized him. The man screamed as he was dragged into the trees. 2 soldiers went after him, firing into the darkness, but they returned moments later alone, their faces grim. We moved faster despite our exhaustion. The torchlight showed us the path, but also made us visible to whatever hunted in the darkness beyond. I heard the priest praying constantly now, his voice a steady murmur that seemed to provide some small protection. The vampire did not attack directly again, but they were still there, always just beyond the light, testing our defenses. We reached the edge of the protected hospital grounds just before midnight. The crosses and blessed barriers that the priest had erected still held, and the vampire would not cross them. We stumbled through the gate and into the courtyard where Captain Walsh and the orderlies were waiting with lanterns and medical supplies. The gate was barred behind us, and we collapsed in exhaustion and relief. The casualties were counted. 8 soldiers dead, including the one taken in the mountains, 6 more wounded to varying degrees. Mills needed surgery on his shoulder. Petrovich's wrist was broken in 3 places, but we had succeeded. The burial ground was cleansed and consecrated. The ancient vampire that had been the source of the corruption were destroyed. Over the following weeks, the nightly attacks on the hospital gradually decreased. The vampire that remained in the mountains seemed less organized, less willing to test our defenses. The priest said that by destroying the oldest and most powerful of their kind, we had broken their ability to coordinate and plan. They were still dangerous, still killed when they could, but they no longer posed the systematic threat they had before. The war continued around us. The fighting in the Balkans ground on through that winter and into the spring. We treated thousands more wounded, saw hundreds more die, but with the protocols the priest had taught us in place, we had no more incidents of the dead rising in our hospital. Everybody was treated with the proper rites. Every grave was properly consecrated. The vampire learned to avoid our protected ground. Mills recovered from his wound, though he never regained full use of his left arm. He was eventually invalided back to Britain, and I lost track of him after the war. Davies continued to serve with distinction and was awarded a medal for his actions in the crypt, though the official citation made no mention of vampire, only referring vaguely to combat in support of Serbian forces. Captain Petrovich returned to active duty once his wrist healed and was killed 6 months later in fighting near the Albanian border. Major Pierce wrote detailed reports of everything we had encountered and sent them up through the chain of command. The reports were classified and filed away, and as far as I know, they remain buried in some military archive to this day. The official position was that we had dealt with enemy infiltrators who had been using psychological warfare tactics to terrorize the local population and disrupt medical operations. No mention was made of vampire or the undead, or anything that could not be explained by conventional military understanding. The priest remained at the village for the duration of the war, blessing our hospital and helping protect not just our facility, but several others that were established in the region. He taught other Orthodox priests the proper techniques for dealing with the vampire, and slowly, the threat was contained, if not entirely eliminated. The old burial grounds were found and cleansed one by one. The proper rites were performed for all the war dead that could be reached. The mountains became safer, though never entirely safe. I served in that hospital until the spring of 1918, when the war in the Balkans finally wound down. I saw the Serbian armies collapse and retreat through Albania, saw the typhus epidemic that killed thousands, saw all the usual horrors of war and disease, but nothing I saw in those final years compared to what we had faced in the winter of 1915. The vampire had been real, more real than I wanted to believe, and they had taught me that the world contained terrors that medical science could not explain or treat. When the war ended, I returned to London and tried to resume a normal life. I set up a private practice in Bloomsbury and treated the usual complaints of wealthy patients who had never seen the things I had seen. I married a woman who asked about my time in the war and accepted my silence when I could not bring myself to tell her the truth. I had children and watched them grow up safe in a world that seemed blessedly free of the supernatural horrors I had encountered. But I never forgot. I kept the small wooden cross the priest had given me, though I told my wife it was simply a war souvenir. I kept copies of my medical notes from that winter, hidden in a locked drawer in my study. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howled around our London house, I would wake from dreams of dark crypts and pale faces and black eyes that reflected no light. And I would check that the crosses were still hanging above the doorways, a habit I had maintained despite my wife's questions about my sudden interest in religious decoration. I read news from the Balkans whenever I could find it. The region remained troubled for decades after the war, seeing more conflict and death. I wondered sometimes if the vampire had returned, if the chaos and violence had awakened them again. But I never went back to find out. I had done my part and survived it, and that was enough. The priest died in 1922. I received a letter from Lazar, informing me of his passing and telling me that the old man had asked to be buried with full precautions, stake and all, just in case. The letter made me smile sadly. Even in death, the priest had been practical about the dangers he had spent his life fighting. Lazar himself died a few years later, in circumstances the letter from his family did not detail. Captain Walsh emigrated to America after the war and became a successful surgeon in New York. We exchanged Christmas cards for many years, but we never discussed what had happened in that Serbian village. Some experiences are too far outside normal understanding to be shared with anyone who was not there. Major Pierce died in 1931 of a stroke. I attended his funeral in Kent and saw many of his former colleagues from his military career, but none from our time in the Balkans. After the service, his widow gave me a sealed envelope that Pierce had left with instructions that I should receive it after his death. Inside was a brief note in Pierce's handwriting. It said simply that he had never regretted ignoring the skepticism of his medical training to accept what we had faced, that doing so had saved lives, and that he hoped I had found peace with the knowledge that some evils were real and required faith as much as science to combat. I did find peace, eventually. I came to understand that the world is larger and stranger than our modern education prepares us to accept. I learned that the old knowledge, the folklore and superstitions that we dismissed as primitive, often contain truths that had been learned through terrible experience. I learned that there are things that walk in darkness that cannot be fought with bullets or scalpels, but only with faith and courage, and the willingness to accept that our rationalist worldview does not contain all the answers. I am old now, past 80, writing this account in the study of my London home in the year of our Lord 1956. My hands shake as I set down these words. Whether from age or from the weight of memory, I cannot say. My wife passed away 2 years ago, and my children live their own lives far from here. I am alone with my memories and my secrets. I have decided to write this down because I believe it needs to be recorded, that future generations should know what we faced in those Serbian mountains and how we survived it. I have no illusions that this account will be believed by most who read it. They will dismiss it as the wanderings of an old man's failing mind, as delusions brought on by the trauma of war. But perhaps somewhere, someone will read these words and recognize the truth in them. Perhaps someone else will face what we faced and will be better prepared, because I took the time to set it all down. The vampire were real. They hunted us in the winter of 1915 in a remote Serbian village whose name I can still barely pronounce. They killed soldiers and villagers and nearly overran our hospital. We destroyed them using methods that would have seemed like superstition to our modern sensibilities, but which proved effective when modern weapons failed. We won because we were willing to set aside our skepticism and accept help from those who understood what we faced. I keep the wooden cross on my desk as I write this. It sits next to my medical journals and my anatomy texts, a reminder that science and faith need not be enemies, that both have their place in understanding the world. The cross is worn smooth now from years of handling, but the blessing the priest placed upon it remains, or so I choose to believe. Sometimes on winter nights I still wake from dreams of that crypt, and those ancient vampires rising from their stone sarcophagi. I still see the faces of the men who died fighting them. I still hear the priest's voice rising in prayer as he drove back the darkness with nothing but faith and words. And I give thanks that I was there to witness it, that I survived to tell the tale, and that I learned the lesson those terrible nights taught me. The world is not what we think it is. There are older things in it than our science can explain, older evils than our philosophy can comprehend. But there are also older protections, older wisdom, and older courage that can stand against those evils when modern methods fail. We must be humble enough to learn from those who came before us, to respect the knowledge that was paid for in blood and terror across centuries of human experience. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed in the winter of 1915 in the mountains of Serbia. I swear by my oath as a physician and by my hope of salvation that every word of it is true. I faced the vampire and I survived, and I have carried that knowledge with me for 40 years, waiting for the right time to share it. That time is now, before age or death silences me forever. May God have mercy on the souls of all who died in that terrible winter, both the living and the undead. May the priest who saved us all rest in peace, with the knowledge that his faith never wavered and his courage never failed. And may those who read this account understand that the darkness is real, but so is the light that can drive it back if we have the wisdom to recognize it and the courage to wield it. I am Dr. Thomas Hartley, late of His Majesty's Royal Army Medical Corps, and this is my confession and my warning to all who will listen. The vampire were real. I saw them, I fought them, and by the grace of God and the knowledge of an old Serbian priest, I live to tell the tale. Remember that when the darkness seems overwhelming, when evil appears unstoppable, when all rational explanations fail, remember that faith and courage and ancient wisdom can still triumph if we are brave enough to use them. This account is finished. I seal it now and place it with my papers to be found after my death. Let it serve as a record and a warning. Let it remind future generations that the world holds mysteries we cannot explain and dangers we cannot face with science alone. Let it stand as proof that good men fought impossible evils and won, not through superior firepower or modern medicine, but through faith and sacrifice and the willingness to believe in things their training told them could not exist. The vampire were real. I was there. This is the truth. May God help anyone who faces what we faced, and may they have the wisdom to listen when the old knowledge speaks. The darkness is real, but the light is stronger, if we have the courage to carry it into the deepest night. That is all I have to say. That is my final testimony. May it be read and understood and remembered when the darkness comes again, as I fear it someday will.